Before I start, I want you to picture a house you cannot leave. Not a house where the doors are locked. A house where leaving has been made, through reasons you'll come to understand, the single most dangerous thing you could possibly do. Where the walls that trap you are also the only thing keeping you alive. Where every instinct in your body is screaming at you to run, and every piece of evidence you have says that running is exactly how you die. I spent 6 days in a house like that in rural Montana 4 years ago. I am a public health investigator. I have worked outbreak response for the CDC state partnership programs for 11 years. I have walked into situations that most people would call nightmares and treated them as Tuesday. Cholera outbreaks, a measles cluster that nearly became something much worse. The early days of things you've read about in the news without knowing my name was attached to them. None of that prepared me for the Hargrove house. I'm going to tell you the whole thing, start to finish, in the order it happened to me, because the order is the only way it makes sense. If I told you the ending first, you would not believe the beginning. If I told you the beginning first without the ending, you would think I was describing a tragedy with a rational explanation. It was not a tragedy with a rational explanation. It was something else. Settle in. This one is long, and it needs to be. My name is Dr. Owen Marsh. I'm 43 years old. I hold a doctorate in epidemiology from the University of Michigan, and I have spent my career in the specific, unglamorous work of outbreak investigation. The people who show up after the first cases are reported and try to understand the shape of what's happening before it becomes something bigger. The call came in on a Thursday morning in October 4 years ago. I was at my desk in Helena, Montana, where I was assigned to the state health department's epidemiology unit on a federal partnership contract, reviewing surveillance data the way I did every Thursday morning, when my supervisor came to my office door with an expression I'd learned to read over a decade of this work. It was the expression that meant something had moved from routine to urgent. She told me a county health officer in a rural county in the eastern part of the state had reported a cluster of illness at a single property. A family, the Hargroves, isolated ranch about 40 miles from the nearest town, multiple household members presenting with a rapidly progressing illness that didn't match any of the standard seasonal patterns. Fever, neurological symptoms, a progression that had moved from the first reported case to severe illness in under 48 hours. 2 members of the household were already dead. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because it's the number that got me on the road within 2 hours of the phone call. 2 deaths in under 48 hours, in a household that hadn't yet been characterized, with an illness profile severe enough and fast enough that my supervisor used a word in that doorway conversation that we don't use casually in this line of work. She used the word contained. She said the county health officer wanted help making sure the situation stayed contained. I drove east out of Helena into the kind of Montana landscape that makes you understand why people fall in love with empty places. Wide valleys, distant mountain ranges, the particular clarity of light you get in high elevation autumn. For hours of driving, the highway narrowing as I went, until I was on county roads and then on a gravel road that led to the Hargrove Ranch. The county health officer, a woman named Diane Castellano, met me at the gate. She'd set up a basic field operation. A folding table, a cooler with water, a clipboard with what information had been gathered so far, and a face that told me she had not slept in at least 24 hours. She walked me through what she knew while we stood outside the property gate. Both of us already in the basic PPE that the situation warranted until we understood more. The Hargrove family had lived on this ranch for 3 generations. The current household consisted of 7 people: Daniel Hargrove, 68, his wife Patricia, 66, their adult son Mark and his wife Karen, both in their early 40s, and 3 grandchildren ranging from 9 to 16. Diane told me the first call had come in 4 days earlier, Patricia Hargrove had called the county health line reporting that her husband had developed a high fever and was experiencing confusion. By the time a visiting nurse reached the property the following day, Daniel Hargrove was dead, and Mark Hargrove had developed the same symptoms. Mark died the following morning. The remaining 5 family members, Patricia, Karen, and the 3 children, were alive but exhibiting early symptoms. I asked Diane the question I had to ask, the question that frames everything in outbreak response. What had they been exposed to? She said she didn't know. She said the family had not traveled recently, had no unusual contact with outside visitors, had not reported any animal bites, had not eaten anything outside their normal diet that she could identify. She said the family had asked repeatedly that no one enter the house. I want to explain something about outbreak protocol that matters for understanding what happened next. When you're investigating a cluster of illness with unknown etiology, particularly one with a severity profile like the one I was looking at, 2 deaths in under 5 days, rapid progression, neurological involvement, the standard approach involves direct assessment of remaining patients, environmental sampling of the location, and careful characterization of exposure pathways. This requires entering the affected location. The Hargroves had asked us not to. Patricia Hargrove, speaking through the closed front door when Diane had attempted contact the day before I arrived, had said the family would manage their own care, would report their condition by phone twice daily, and did not want anyone, health officials, family members, anyone, entering the house. This is unusual. It is not unheard of. People in crisis sometimes withdraw, sometimes distrust authority, sometimes simply want to manage their own situation in their own way. But combined with the severity of what we were looking at, it created an immediate and serious tension between respecting a family's wishes and the public health imperative to understand what was killing them before it could spread further. I made the call that we needed to enter. I want to be honest that I have asked myself many times in the years since whether that was the right call. I believe it was the right call given what I knew at the time. I am less certain now whether it was the right call given what I came to understand by the end. We approached the house in the early afternoon. Full PPE, N95 respirators, eye protection, gowns, gloves, the complete protocol for an unknown pathogen with potential aerosol or contact transmission. Diane stayed at the perimeter, in radio contact, while I approached with a second investigator, a younger CDC officer named Priya Anand who had been dispatched from the regional office to assist. The Hargrove house was a large farmhouse, 2 stories, the kind of solid practical construction that characterizes ranch houses built to last across generations. The curtains were drawn on every visible window. The front porch was empty except for a row of boots by the door, arranged neatly, the way a family arranges boots when they expect to need them again. I knocked. It took almost a full minute before the door opened, just a crack, secured by a chain. Patricia Hargrove's face appeared in the gap. She was pale, visibly unwell, but coherent, and her eyes moved over our PPE with an expression I read, at the time, as simple distrust of outside authority. I have come to understand since that it was something closer to recognition, as if she had seen people dressed like us before in some other context, and the sight confirmed something she'd been afraid of. I introduced myself. I explained that we needed to assess the household, understand the illness, help protect them and anyone else who might be at risk. She said, "You can't help us." I said we wanted to try. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "If you come in, you stay in. Do you understand that? Once the door closes, it doesn't open again until this is finished." I told her I understood the protocol for isolation during an active investigation, and that yes, once we entered, we would need to remain for the duration of our assessment period. She looked at me with an expression that I have replayed many times since, trying to understand what she was actually telling me in that moment versus what I understood her to be telling me. She said, "That's not what I mean." And then she opened the door. The interior of the Hargrove house was dim, curtains drawn throughout, lights kept low, the particular hush of a house where people are sick and the household has organized itself around managing illness. The air had the specific smell that I associate, after 11 years of this work, with serious illness in a domestic setting, fever sweat, the chemical tang of over-the-counter medications, and underlying mustiness that I would come to understand had a more specific source. Patricia led us through the front hall into the main living room, where the remaining family members were gathered. Karen Hargrove, the daughter-in-law, was on the couch under a heavy blanket despite the warm afternoon, visibly febrile, her face flushed. The three children, I'll call them by their approximate ages rather than their names, out of respect for the family, the 16-year-old, the 13-year-old, and the 9-year-old, were scattered around the room, the older two reading or attempting to occupy themselves, the youngest curled against Karen on the couch. All five of them looked unwell. Fever was visually apparent in all of them. The 16-year-old had a tremor in his hands that he was trying to control. The 13-year-old's eyes had a glassy quality that I recognized from other neurological presentations I'd seen in my career, and recognizing it made my chest tighten in a way that I had to consciously manage. I began the assessment. Vitals, symptom history, exposure questions. Priya worked alongside me documenting, and we fell into the practiced rhythm that this kind of work develops. The exposure history yielded nothing useful. No unusual food, no travel, no contact with wild animals beyond the normal incidental contact of ranch life. No new visitors to the property in months. No water source changes. The well had been tested 2 years prior and came back clean, and Patricia insisted nothing about it had changed. I asked about Daniel and Mark's final days. What symptoms preceded death, in what order, how rapid the progression had been. Patricia described it carefully, methodically, the way someone describes something they have forced themselves to observe clinically because the alternative, feeling it fully, is not survivable in the moment. Fever first, then confusion, disorientation, then a specific symptom that made me go very still as she described it. Both men, in their final hours, had reported seeing things that weren't there. Not simple confusion or delirium, but specific, detailed hallucinations that they described in coherent sentences even as their physical condition deteriorated. She said Daniel had spent his last conscious hours describing, in detail, a conversation with his own father, who had died in 1987. She said Mark had spent his last hours apologizing, repeatedly, to someone in the room that no one else could see. I asked who he had been apologizing to. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. She said he didn't say a name. He just kept saying he was sorry. He kept saying it wasn't supposed to happen this way. I want to walk you through the next several hours carefully, because this is where the investigation began to diverge from anything in my professional experience. I collected samples, blood, when the patients would allow it, environmental swabs from surfaces throughout the house, water samples from the well and the household plumbing. I documented the house's layout, looking for any environmental source, mold, chemical exposure, anything that could account for a rapid onset neurological illness affecting multiple household members. The house itself was old, built in the early 1900s, the original structure of the ranch, added onto over the generations but maintaining its original core. As I moved through it for the environmental assessment, I began to notice details that I logged in my notes without, at the time, understanding their significance. There was a room on the second floor at the end of the hallway that was locked. Patricia told me it was unused, storage only, nothing relevant to the investigation. I noted it and did not press the issue at the time, focused as I was on the clinical assessment. There was a Bible on the kitchen table, open to a specific passage, with handwritten notes in the margins in several different handwritings, suggesting it had been read and annotated across multiple generations of the family. There was a calendar in the kitchen, the kind that hangs on the wall with a page for each month, and I noticed, again logged but not immediately understood, that the current month's page had a date circled. 3 days in the future from the day I was standing in that kitchen. No note, no explanation, just a circle around a date. By evening, I had completed the initial environmental and clinical assessment without identifying a clear source for the illness. The symptom profile was unlike anything in our standard differential: the speed of progression, the specific neurological features, the absence of any clear infectious or toxic exposure pathway. I made the call to my supervisor using the satellite phone I'd brought given the property's lack of reliable cell coverage. I described what I'd found, or rather what I hadn't found, and recommended that we needed extended observation, additional samples sent for specialized analysis, and that Priya and I should remain on-site to monitor the remaining patients given the severity and unpredictability of the progression. This is standard protocol. In a situation with this level of severity and this level of diagnostic uncertainty, remaining with the patients to observe progression in real time, ready to intervene, is the appropriate response. What I did not fully process in that moment was Patricia Hargrove's earlier statement. Once the door closes, it doesn't open again until this is finished. I thought she had been describing the standard isolation protocol that I myself had explained to her. I did not yet understand that she had been describing something else entirely. Priya and I set up our monitoring station in the living room, keeping watch on the family through the evening and into the night, checking vitals on a rotating schedule, documenting any changes in symptom presentation. The children eventually fell into restless sleep, scattered across the couches and chairs, Karen remaining febrile but stable, Patricia moving between caring for her grandchildren and daughter-in-law and answering our occasional questions with the patient exhaustion of someone running on reserves she didn't have. Around 11 p.m., I went to use the bathroom down the hall from the living room, and on my way back, I passed the staircase leading to the second floor. The locked room. I want to be honest that professional protocol would have suggested leaving it alone. Patricia had told me it was storage, irrelevant to the investigation, and pressing the issue without clear justification would have been an overreach of the trust the family had extended in allowing us into their home at all. But something about it had been sitting with me since the afternoon. A specific unease that I could not articulate professionally, but that, 11 years into this work, I have learned not to ignore. I climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark, lit only by a single small lamp at the far end. The locked door was exactly where I'd noted it, a standard interior door with a simple latch lock, the kind that could be opened from the outside with a basic tool if necessary. I stood outside it and listened. I heard nothing. I want to be precise about that, because what I'm about to describe happened in the absence of any sound from inside the room, which made it more unsettling rather than less. I felt cold, not metaphorically. A specific localized temperature drop that I registered physically. The hallway, which had been comfortable, became distinctly cold in the few feet immediately surrounding that door, in a way that had no climate control explanation I could identify. I put my hand against the door. The wood was cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. I went back downstairs. I did not tell Priya about this immediately. I want to be honest about that. Partly because I wasn't sure what I had actually experienced versus what 11 hours of exhausting, disturbing investigation might have primed me to perceive, and partly because I needed to think it through before I could articulate it in a way that wouldn't sound like I was losing the kind of professional composure that this work requires. Around 2 in the morning, the 9-year-old woke screaming. I want to describe this carefully because it was the first moment that the situation moved, in my understanding, from a medical mystery to something I didn't have a framework for. She was screaming a name, not crying from fever or fear in the generalized way children do when they're sick and frightened. Screaming a specific name, repeatedly, with the particular desperate clarity of someone trying to warn or stop something. The name was Daniel, her grandfather, who had died 4 days earlier. Patricia rushed to her, holding her, trying to calm her, and the girl, fevered, shaking, kept saying between sobs that she'd seen him, that he'd been standing at the foot of her bed, that he'd told her something. Patricia asked, very carefully, very gently, what he'd told her. The girl said, he said it's not finished. He said the door has to stay closed until it's finished. Patricia went very pale. She looked at me specifically, not at Priya, with an expression that I understood, finally, as the moment she decided to tell me something she had been withholding. She asked Priya to stay with the children and Karen, and she took me into the kitchen, away from the rest of the family, and she told me what she had not told the county health officer, had not told the visiting nurse, had not told anyone outside her immediate family in years. She said the Hargrove family had owned this land since 1911. She said the original house, the core structure that the current house had been built around and onto, had been built by her husband's great-grandfather. She said that in 1923, during construction of an addition to the original house, the family had disturbed something. She did not have precise details. The story had been passed down across 4 generations, losing specificity each time it was retold, the way oral history does. But the essential shape of it was this: workers excavating for a foundation extension had found something in the ground. Not human remains, she was careful to specify, though I am not certain she fully believed her own clarification. Something else. An object or a structure or a marker. The family's account across generations used different words for it, never settling on a consistent description. Whatever it was, the family had not removed it, had not reported it, had simply built around it and over it and incorporated it into the foundation of what became the locked second-floor room. And from that point forward, every generation of the Hargrove family had maintained a specific practice that Patricia described to me with the careful precision of someone reciting a ritual she had learned by rote without ever fully believing she would need to use it herself. Every year, at a specific time that shifted based on a calculation Patricia did not fully understand, but that her mother-in-law had performed faithfully every year of her life, the family would seal that second-floor room completely, close it off, maintain it as closed and undisturbed for a period of several days. She said her mother-in-law had told her, decades earlier, that the practice existed because something in that room tested the house once a year, and that the test had a specific outcome depending on whether the room remained sealed throughout its duration. She said the test had never failed in 4 generations. She said this year, this October, was the test. And she said that 4 days ago, before Patricia's husband and son had fallen ill, someone. She did not know who, possibly one of the children, possibly even one of the adults in a moment of distraction, had opened that door. I sat in that kitchen and listened to Patricia Hargrove describe a 100-year family practice built around sealing a room that, according to 4 generations of inherited belief, contained something that needed to remain undisturbed on a yearly cycle, and that this year's seal had been broken before the cycle completed. I want to be honest about my reaction in that moment, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened afterward. My first reaction was clinical skepticism. 11 years of outbreak investigation teaches you that families under extreme stress generate explanatory narratives, sometimes religious, sometimes superstitious, sometimes simply desperate attempts to impose order on chaos that has no order. I have heard dozens of variations of this kind of story across my career, families attributing illness to curses, to angered spirits, to broken taboos, and in every single prior instance, the actual cause of illness had a scientific explanation that simply hadn't been identified yet. I told myself this was the same. I asked Patricia what she thought was actually happening medically, physically, to her family. She said she didn't know what the medical explanation was. She said she only knew the pattern. She said in 1958, her husband's grandmother had told her about a year when the seal had been broken. Not deliberately, an accident, a worker doing repairs who hadn't understood the practice, and 2 members of the household had died within a week, with the same symptom progression Daniel and Mark had shown. She said the household had survived that year, the surviving members, because they had managed to reseal the room and maintain isolation until what she called the cycle completed. She said that was what she had been trying to do when she'd asked us not to enter the house. She said our presence, outsiders breaking the isolation she had been trying to maintain, might have made things worse. I asked her very directly what she believed would happen if the room remained unsealed and the household, now including Priya and myself, did not maintain isolation until whatever cycle she was describing completed. She looked at me with an expression of complete, exhausted sincerity. She said, "I think everyone in this house dies, the way Daniel and Mark died, one at a time until it's finished. I am going to tell you what happened over the following 5 days as objectively as I can, because I have spent 4 years trying to construct a rational explanation for these events and I have not succeeded. And I think the most honest thing I can do is present what happened without forcing it into a framework that makes it more comfortable than it was." By the morning of the 2nd day, Karen Hargrove's condition had worsened significantly. Fever spiking, the early signs of the neurological symptoms that had preceded both deaths. Priya and I worked to manage her symptomatically. We had limited medical supplies, no ability to evacuate given the isolation protocol I myself had initiated and that Patricia's warnings had reinforced, and a growing, uncomfortable awareness that we were now trapped in a situation we did not fully understand. I made contact with my supervisor via satellite phone and described the situation honestly, the clinical picture and, with significant hesitation, the family's account of the locked room and its yearly significance. I want you to understand that what I am about to tell you happened in a professional public health emergency response context, with documentation, with another trained investigator present, with satellite communication to supervisory staff. This was not an isolated, uncorroborated experience. Priya Anand experienced everything I am about to describe alongside me, and her independent documentation, filed separately from mine in the weeks following, corroborates every detail. My supervisor's response, predictably, was that the family's belief system, however sincerely held, did not change the clinical reality, and that our priority remained identifying the actual pathogen or toxin responsible for the illness and managing patient care accordingly. She authorized an extraction plan. A medevac helicopter would be dispatched the following morning to remove the sickest patients, with appropriate isolation protocols, to a hospital capable of more advanced care. I relayed this to Patricia. She became more distressed than I had seen her at any point in the investigation. She said, "You can't take anyone out of this house before the cycle completes. If the seal is broken and someone leaves, it follows them." I asked what she meant by "it follows them." She said, "I don't know what it is. Nobody in this family has ever known what it is. We only know what it does and what stops it from doing it." That afternoon, I went back upstairs to the locked room. I want to explain my reasoning because at the time it felt like sound professional judgment, and in retrospect I recognize it as something closer to compulsion. I told myself I needed to assess the room as a potential environmental source, mold, chemical exposure, anything that could account for the neurological symptoms, particularly if the room had been sealed for long periods and developed unusual air quality. This was technically within the scope of a legitimate environmental investigation. Priya came with me. I want to note that for the record because what we experienced together simultaneously and have since corroborated independently to each other and to our supervisors. The door was unlocked. Patricia had given me the key after our conversation, with visible reluctance, saying only that if I was going to enter regardless, she wanted me to understand what I was looking for. I asked what that was. She said, "You'll know it when you see it. Don't touch anything. Don't move anything. Just look and then close the door and we lock it again and we wait." The room itself, when we opened it, was unremarkable in almost every visible way. A small bedroom-sized space, sparse furnishing, a single chair, a small table, bare walls. The window was boarded over from the inside, which I noted as unusual but not immediately alarming. The cold I had felt the previous night in the hallway was present inside the room itself, more pronounced, a temperature differential that my handheld thermometer registered as approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit colder than the hallway outside. And in the center of the floor, where based on the room's dimensions and Patricia's description of the original 1923 construction, the original disturbed ground would have been located, there was a section of floorboard that was visibly different from the rest. Older, darker, a slightly different wood grain, clearly original to a much earlier construction phase than the rest of the room, which based on the house's documented renovation history would have dated to the 1920s edition. I did not touch it. Patricia's instruction had been explicit, and despite my professional instinct to investigate further, something about the room, the cold, the stillness, the specific quality of silence that I have struggled to describe accurately in the years since, made me follow her instruction without argument. Priya, standing beside me, said something I have never forgotten. She said, "I don't think we should be in here." Her voice was completely level, completely professional, but underneath it was something I recognized because I was feeling it myself. A specific bodily certainty that we were in the presence of something that did not want us there. We closed the door. We locked it. We went back downstairs. The medevac helicopter arrived the following morning as scheduled. I want to walk through what happened with as much precision as I can manage, because this is the section of the story that I have the most difficulty articulating, and that I believe most directly demonstrates that what we experienced was not simply a family's shared delusion that Priya and I absorbed through prolonged exposure and stress. The helicopter landed in the open field beside the house. The medical team prepared to load Karen Hargrove, whose condition had continued to deteriorate, along with the 9-year-old, whose fever had spiked overnight in a way that concerned me significantly. Patricia begged me, in the moments before the loading began, not to allow it. She said the cycle would not complete for 3 more days, the circled date on the kitchen calendar. I understood now, marking the end point of whatever yearly test the family believed they were enduring, and that removing anyone from the property before then would not save them. I made the clinical decision that the medical risk of remaining without advanced care outweighed the family's belief-based concerns. I authorized the evacuation. Karen Hargrove and the 9-year-old were loaded onto the helicopter. It lifted off at approximately 9:15 in the morning, heading for the regional medical center 90 miles away. Crashed 11 minutes later. I want to be extremely careful and precise about what I'm telling you here, because this is a documented, investigated incident covered by the National Transportation Safety Board, and I am not asserting a supernatural cause for the crash itself. The NTSB investigation, completed 8 months later, attributed the crash to a sudden and severe mechanical failure in the tail rotor assembly. a failure mode that the investigating engineers described in their report as extremely rare and not attributable to any maintenance deficiency or pilot error. What I am telling you is what I experienced in the moment the helicopter went down, which I and Priya both witnessed from the ground. The helicopter was at altitude, moving away from the property, when it began to spin, the characteristic loss of tail rotor authority spin that the NTSB report later confirmed. It went down in open rangeland approximately 2 miles from the Hargrove property. Both patients aboard, the pilot and the flight medic, were killed. I have read the NTSB report many times. I do not dispute its findings about the mechanical cause. What I cannot reconcile in the years since is the timing 11 minutes after departure from a property that a family had spent generations insisting could not be safely left before a specific date by anyone under any circumstances. I do not have an explanation for that timing that satisfies me. After the crash, everything changed. I want to be honest that I am not proud of every decision I made in the hours and days that followed. The deaths of 4 people, 2 patients and 2 crew members, under my clinical authorization sent me into a state that I would, in retrospect, characterize as acute traumatic stress, compounded by an environment that was already disorienting and frightening in ways I did not have professional vocabulary for. My supervisor, informed of the crash, authorized whatever measures I deemed necessary for the safety of the remaining patients and personnel, effectively giving me operational authority over the situation given the communication difficulties and the chaos of the immediate aftermath. I made the decision to follow Patricia's protocol. I want to be clear about what that meant, because I am aware of how it sounds from a clinical and professional standpoint. I authorized the household, myself, Priya, Patricia, and the 2 remaining children, to seal ourselves into the house completely. No entry, no exit, no further evacuation attempts, until the date Patricia had identified on the kitchen calendar. 3 more days. I do not have a clean professional justification for this decision. I had a dead patient evacuation, a crashed helicopter, 2 more deaths, and a family who had now lost 4 members in under a week, insisting that the only path forward was complete isolation following a protocol with no scientific basis whatsoever. What I had also was a cold room with a section of original 1920s flooring at its center, a documented 15-degree temperature differential with no climate explanation, a family history spanning 4 generations that included a previous incident with an identical outcome pattern, and a helicopter crash with a timing I could not explain. I made the decision based on something that was not entirely scientific. I want to own that. We sealed the house. The following 3 days were the longest of my professional life. I am not going to describe every detail of those 72 hours, because much of it was simply the grinding, exhausting work of managing 2 critically ill children, the 13-year-old and now the 16-year-old, whose conditions had both worsened, with limited medical supplies, no possibility of evacuation, and the specific psychological weight of having already lost 4 people to a situation I did not understand. What I will tell you is what happened on the second of those 3 nights, because it is the experience that I have never been able to set aside, that visits me regularly even now, for years later. Around 3 in the morning, I woke from a brief period of rest to find Priya standing at the bottom of the staircase, looking up toward the 2nd floor, completely still. I asked her what was wrong. She said, "Listen." I listened. From the 2nd floor, from the locked room specifically, based on the direction of the sound, there was movement. Not loud, not dramatic. The specific sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across a wooden floor. The room was locked. The key was on a chain around Patricia's neck, where she had kept it since giving it to me for our initial assessment and taking it back afterward. I confirmed this immediately. Patricia, woken by our voices, showed me the key was still secured, still in her possession, the lock undisturbed. The footsteps continued, slow, patient, moving the length of what I had measured during our assessment as a small room, a room that should not have permitted more than a few steps in any direction. The footsteps continued for what my watch confirmed was 11 minutes. The same number, I noted with a chill I have never fully shaken, as the minutes between the helicopter's departure and its crash. Then they stopped. On the morning of the third day, the date circled on Patricia's calendar. Both remaining sick children showed sudden, dramatic improvement. Fever broke in both of them within an hour of each other. The neurological symptoms resolved, and by midday both were sitting up, eating, asking questions about what had happened, with the specific disoriented quality of people emerging from serious illness with limited memory of its worst stretches. I documented their vitals obsessively throughout the day, half expecting a relapse, a worsening, anything that would explain what I had witnessed as something other than what Patricia's family history had predicted. The relapse never came. By evening, with both children stable and improving, Patricia asked me to come upstairs with her. She unlocked the door to the second-floor room. I want to describe what we found, because it is the final piece of this story that I have never been able to resolve into a comfortable explanation. The room was warm. The 15-degree temperature differential I had measured days earlier was gone entirely. My thermometer now showed the room at the same temperature as the hallway outside, consistent with normal household heating. The section of original 1920s floorboard at the center of the room, the section Patricia had specifically instructed me not to touch, was undisturbed in its position but had changed in appearance. Where it had been darker, older looking, with a visibly different grain than the surrounding floor, it now appeared identical to the rest of the room's flooring. Same color, same finish, same apparent age. I photographed it. I have the photographs still. Side by side with the photographs from days earlier, the difference is undeniable and, to me, completely inexplicable through any framework I have access to. Patricia looked at the floor for a long moment. She said, "It's finished. Until next year." We left the Hargrove property the following morning. I filed my reports, the clinical reports which documented everything observable and measurable, the symptom progressions, the deaths, the helicopter crash, the eventual recovery. I did not include, in my official reporting, the account of the locked room, the footsteps, the temperature changes, the family's belief system. I included them only in a separate, personal account that I wrote in the weeks following, partly for my own processing and partly because I felt, even then, that someone should have a complete record of what actually happened, even if that record could never be official. This story is the first time I have shared that complete record publicly. The official cause of death for Daniel and Mark Hargrove, and for the 2 evacuated patients and 2 crew members who died in the helicopter crash, were all determined through standard medical and forensic processes. Daniel and Mark's deaths were ultimately attributed to an unidentified rapid-onset viral encephalitis that could not be specifically characterized despite extensive laboratory analysis, a frustrating but not unprecedented outcome in outbreak investigation. The helicopter crash was attributed to mechanical failure, as I described. These explanations are, as far as the official record is concerned, complete and sufficient. I do not find them complete and sufficient. I have not found them complete and sufficient for 4 years. I have stayed in occasional contact with Patricia Hargrove since that investigation. The family remains on the ranch. The 2 surviving children, now 4 years older, are, as far as I know, healthy and well-adjusted, the kind of resilience that children sometimes show that adults find both remarkable and slightly heartbreaking. Patricia tells me every October that they have sealed the room again, that the cycle has continued every year since without incident. She has never told me what she believes is actually in that room, or what it actually is, or why the practice exists in the specific form it does. She has told me every time we speak that she does not know either, that the practice has simply been passed down generation to generation, a ritual maintained out of inherited necessity rather than understood mechanism. I asked her once, in our most recent conversation, whether she had ever considered simply leaving the property, selling the ranch, walking away from a 100-year-old practice that had already cost her husband and her son. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Where would we go that it wouldn't follow us?" I did not have an answer for her. I still don't. I am an epidemiologist. I believe in evidence, in mechanism, in the patient accumulation of data that eventually resolves uncertainty into understanding. 11 years into this career, I have solved outbreaks that seemed, at their outset, completely inexplicable by simply continuing to gather information until the pattern revealed itself. I have not solved the Hargrove house. I have a cold room that warmed itself in the space of 72 hours. I have a section of antique flooring that changed its appearance without any physical intervention I witnessed. I have footsteps in a locked room, 11 minutes long, the same 11 minutes that separated a helicopter's departure from its crash. I have 4 generations of a family maintaining a practice they don't understand, based on consequences they have directly experienced and cannot explain. I have 6 days in a house I could not leave, surrounded by a family who understood, better than I did, exactly what kind of danger we were in. I think about that house more than I think about anything else in my career. I think about Patricia's question, where would we go that it wouldn't follow us? More than I am comfortable admitting. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure anyone does. That's the story. I know it was long. I know it asked a lot of you, sitting with all of this for the better part of 2 hours. If you made it all the way through, if you stayed in that house with me the whole time, I want you to know that's exactly the kind of audience this channel exists for. Subscribe right now if you haven't already. This is one of the longest, most layered stories I've told, and there are more like it coming. Stories that don't resolve neatly. Stories where the evidence and the impossible sit right next to each other and refuse to be separated. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Hit like. I'm going to be honest with you. Stories this long take an enormous amount of effort to put together, and the like button is the single clearest signal that this kind of deep, slow burn horror is worth continuing to make. If you felt the dread building the way I intended it to build, let me know with a like. And leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done in my position. Tell me whether you believe the helicopter crash was coincidence or something else. Tell me if your family has a practice like the Hargroves, something passed down that nobody fully understands but everybody maintains anyway, just in case. I read every comment, every single one. Patricia asked me a question I still don't have an answer for. Maybe one of you does. I'll be reading. See you on the next story.